You're listening to part 2 of a Barefoot Lawyer Reports on China presentation by Yashue Cao, director of the documentary The Defenders, 20 Years of Human Rights Lawyers in China. To listen to part 1 of her presentation and to see her documentary, please check the link in the description.
In the decade following China's accession to the WTO and the arrival of the internet around the turn of the century, the economy grew rapidly, and the civil rights awareness also quickly developed among the Chinese people, with the explosion of information and dramatically improved living standards. Though this awareness often didn't express itself as open demands for political change, the regime felt increasingly threatened. The day-to-day struggle for rights and justice was often fought where else? In court, and associated with one group, lawyers. Not all lawyers, though. Most lawyers in China do toe the line and play safe, focusing on making money. But a small number of them emerged with a strong passion for justice, for professional dignity, and they believed in the direction of the rule of law. They insisted on the sanctity of the law and fought bravely and tenaciously every step of the way in the judicial process to seek a fair and just application of the law. They were drawn to cases where the law was abused the most. Having studied them for several years, I have noticed the phenomenon worth pondering, and I'm going to tell you, and I leave it for you to ponder. Most of these human rights lawyers came from very humble backgrounds. That's one. 2, a significant percentage of them have been drawn to the Christian faith. Why is that? They are working against all odds, fighting an upward battle. They quickly learned to mobilize public opinion and support through the internet, knowing that without exposing the injustice suffered by their clients and the abusive legal process, they had little chance of deterring judicial wrongdoings. Rights defense lawyers drew the ire of the government on many levels. Punishment followed. For example, of the 14 lawyers and the legal activist that you just saw at the beginning of the film, 13 out of 14 suffered torture, physical beating, imprisonment, or were disbarred in the years afterwards. Gao Zhisheng had served 4 years in prison, then was forcefully disappeared in 2017. Nobody has heard from him since, 7 years. We don't know where he is or whether he's still alive today. In July 12, a think tank under the aegis of the Ministry of State Security published an article in the overseas edition of People's Daily, the party's mouthpiece, of course, titled "China's Real Challenge Lies in the Next 5 to 10 Years." It identified 5 groups of people who, quote, attempted to change China from the bottom up in the name of internet freedom and the liberal democracy. Rights defense lawyers, underground religious believers, dissidents, internet opinion leaders, and the vulnerable groups. Please note that rights lawyers lead the pack. That the rights defense lawyers are singled out as the first of the 5 groups reflects the party's deep-seated worries about these lawyers, though its numbers is disproportionately smaller compared to the other 4 categories. That's because rights lawyers are the connecting nodes of all persecuted and marginalized groups in China. Their services are also sought by persecuted private entrepreneurs and fallen party officials, as I said before. In the years between 2006 and 2014, while the number of rights lawyers expanded, they were constantly targeted and suppressed, and some had their licenses revoked. But the biggest shock came in 2015, known as the 709 crackdown. I don't know how many of them have heard of a 709 crackdown, but no worries, I'm going to tell you. The arrests began on July 9th, 2015. That's why it's called the 709, July 9th. And continued throughout the next few days in Beijing, Changsha, Guangzhou, Guilin, and elsewhere. Wang Yu, a Beijing lawyer, whom you will see later in the film, was dragged away in pajamas from her home in the dead of night. Zhou Shifeng, the director of a Beijing Fengrui law firm, was asleep in a hotel room when an unidentified man kicked the door open early in the morning, sealed his mouth with duct tape, and whisked him away. Li Heping, another lawyer, was accosted by several men in his office parking lot at noon as he stepped out of his car. Wang Quanzhang was swimming in a spring when he was surrounded by scores of officers and several police cars, so on and so forth. Every arrest was dramatic. All the arrests was carried out by plainclothes police acting without warrant. The 709 crackdown rounded up more than 20 lawyers and staffers, while over 300 lawyers and rights activists nationwide were summoned or visited by police, warning them not to speak out or rally support for the arrested lawyers. They claimed that the arrested lawyers had committed serious crimes. In the course of hundreds of interrogations of the 709 lawyers, an interrogator once said that the aim of the 709 case was to create a hot stove effect for the lawyers across China. Once they realized the stove, that is, sensitive legal cases, is burning hot, they should avoid touching it for their own good. Ironically, that interrogator had revealed the truth about the whole affair. That is, the 709 crackdown was an act of terror. To make the lawyers admit guilt for crimes that they didn't commit, police employed horrendous torture unthinkable in the 21st century. They forged evidence. They obstructed defense attorneys engaged by the 709 detainees' relatives and forced them to accept attorneys appointed by the government. Sham trials were conducted to complete the process. But not a single trial and its verdict can stand the slightest scrutiny. The court's criminal judgments present nearly identical words against the 709 defendants. These include, quote, dissatisfaction with the national political system and judicial system, and engaging in criminal activity to subvert state power and overthrow the socialist system, end quote. However, the court fails to make its cases against these lawyers with their so-called facts and evidence because they just don't hold water. None of them amounts to anything, let alone the crime of subversion of state power. The suppression of lawyers has been systematic. Since 2015, the Chinese judicial authorities have revoked the license of at least 40 human rights lawyers. As I mentioned earlier, new regulations have been enacted in recent years to further restrict their work and expression. You know what have changed for the better in the Chinese judicial system? The court buildings. They're new, stately, and huge, not only in major cities, but in small towns and districts everywhere. I have a few photos there. What hasn't changed is how justice is dispensed. Writing this speech, I looked up the trial of the Gang of Four. I noticed the following features: lengthy secret detention without trial, used torture to force submission. Defense lawyers were picked and coordinated by the state to give the appearance that the defendants were afforded the right to counsel. Witnesses were trained to collaborate with the prosecutors. The trial was rehearsed. The courtroom audience was carefully selected. Convictions and sentences were predetermined before the trial. Only state media reporters were allowed in the courtroom. State media coverage was carefully edited to reflect and enhance the official narrative. So, 35 years later, the trial of 709 lawyers in those huge, new, gleaming court buildings bear exactly the same features. In some respects, things are far worse now. So I say, to this day, Chinese judiciary is still very much a cosplay. Finally, just a few words about the film. It was made in 2022. It's a very imperfect work. I'm not a professional filmmaker to begin with. In terms of the content, there were many important omissions, either because there was no historical footage to use, or lawyers were in prison, not available for interview. In terms of the video quality, half of the footage were from other sources with permission, with not so great resolution. But as imperfect as it is, I do hope that when you leave here today, your idea of China will be somewhat altered, if not radically. Enjoy the rest of the film. Thank you very much.
The Catholic University of America's Center for Human Rights has published a documentary on the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The documentary features world-class human rights experts, from former State Department officials to ambassadors and human rights activists. It can be found on our website at humanrights.catholic.edu.